Okay, we're going to get started here. As always, we've got a lot to cover. We will be today finishing up with John chapter 13. Uh-oh. Doesn't look like my clicker's working. Huh. It's always something. Well, I'm just going to try one of the other clickers and see. Oh, it's because it's not active. Okay. Yeah. Bingo. Ooh, that was an easy fix. They're not always easy. We're going to, at least the plan is to finish up chapter 13 today and provide an introduction to what comes next, because this next section, as we get into chapters 14, 15, 16, and 17, is all sort of one block. And it's a real challenging block for us. But we'll, like I said, we'll get through 13 today and hopefully get the introduction to 14, 15, 16, and 17. Remember that in 13, what we've been talking about is this final Passover meal that Jesus celebrated. And we looked at these two sections already. In verses 1 through 17, we saw the episode where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And then we looked last week at verses 18 through 30, where amidst all the hubbub going on around the table, Jesus dismissed his betrayer, Judas, but it's not clear that everyone knew what was going on. In fact, it's clear that not everyone knew what was going on, because the text tells us that when Judas actually left, some thought that he was going to buy more supplies for the meal, and some thought that he was going to make a donation for the poor. And there's no indication that anyone aside from the disciple whom Jesus loved, which we identified as the Apostle John, he seems to have been the only one who saw what was really going on real time with Judas. So that's where we went last week, and now today we get to this section in verses 31 through 38, which really provides a bridge into the next section, the challenging section between 14 and 17. So that's where we will pick up today, is with what I'm calling the beginning of farewell. But this, of course, includes Jesus' interaction with Peter once again. As we just said, this section provides a transition. And if you think about what's been going on in the room all night that night, there's been a lot of conflict and trouble in the room already. When the disciples walked in, there was this rivalry about who was going to get the best seats and things like that. And that was going on in the room. Jesus ultimately settles that and squashes it by washing all their feet. But then there's also this undercurrent as Jesus announces that there's a traitor in their midst. And even though they don't necessarily identify which one of them it is, they're all shocked by that. So there's been a lot of trouble in the room until this point. And now we make this, we see John painting this picture of this bridge as we move from the events that have gone on in the upper room to the themes that will show up in chapters 14 through 17. And those themes are these. Number one, that Jesus will be glorified. And that's a theme that will permeate everything we look at for the next 3 to 4 chapters. Jesus will be preparing them for this time of separation that is coming and imminent. And then the third thing is that he will also introduce the new system. And the new system will be based on love. And that's where Jesus lands with this monologue that he carries through the next several chapters. So Judas has now left the room, and it's amazing to think that everybody who's remaining in the room is going to die for Jesus. Everybody in the room is ultimately going to give their life for Jesus. And so there's been a bit of a purge amongst their midst so that Jesus can get down to the realities of what these guys need to know. Okay, so the first thing we pick up with in verses 31 and 32 is that Jesus will be glorified. And as I said, as Jesus announces this, he's also preparing what's coming in chapters 14 through 17 and all the talk about Jesus' glory. But here we see him introduce it in verses 31 and 32. The text reads, when he, and this is Judas, when Judas was gone, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself, and will glorify him at once. Now, at least for me, until I took this thing apart, that's a confusing series of phrases. But I think if we work our way through it, we'll be able to figure it out. In verse 31, what Jesus is saying is that he's going to be glorified because he will have fulfilled his work that the Father gave him to do. And there will be glory in that, the fact that he has finally completed the task. The text starts out, now is the Son of Man glorified. So as he completes those tasks given to the Son of Man, that will bring glory to him. So the fact that he is completing the work, and he will complete that work, of course, on the cross and by being raised, and as those things come to pass, then Jesus will be glorified in that. And then the last part of the verse says, God is glorified in him. Well, because Jesus has completed the task given by the Father, that brings glory to God. The fact that Jesus went to the cross, that he gave this tremendous sacrifice on behalf of all mankind, that is something now that God, it reflects back on God's character and God's goodness, because Jesus has been reflecting everything to God the Father anyhow. So that's what that verse means. Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. Okay? Then we move on to verse 32. And verse 32 starts looking more into the future. First of all, the text says, if God is glorified in him, meaning that if God is glorified as we've just laid out, then God will glorify the Son in himself. What's being talked about there is that God will restore Jesus to the glory of heaven and to his rightful place in the grand order of things. So this is a second type of glorification. The first glorification is with Jesus being crucified and fulfilling the work that the Father gave him to do. But then the Father will turn around and place Jesus back in his rightful place. Jesus' time of humility and becoming a servant to all mankind, that has been completed. And now he is restored to his heavenly position. And then the third thing that is said in verse 32, we said, if God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once. This is coming. This is imminent. So this is about to happen. This is about to take place. Jesus will be undergoing both of those glorifications. And I just skipped 2 verses, or 2 clicks. So there we have. We have verse 31 talking about the completion of Jesus' earthly mission. And then verse 32, Jesus will be restored to his heavenly position with God. Okay? And then the tail end of this indicates that this is about to happen. So Jesus has described now 2 separate glorifications. The purpose of his coming to earth, which was to show us the Father, show us what the Father's like, and then to complete the salvation process. okay, or possibility, we should say. And then the second glorification is as Jesus resumes his rightful place with the Father. So, the next thing we see in verse 33, and this is another part of that theme as Jesus is looking ahead to chapter 14 and what he wants to get across to those who are still present in the room. He says this great change is about to happen. It's now. So let's take a look at verse 33. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me. Just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. Notice how he starts this out, first of all. He says, my children. What does that tell you when Jesus says that? Relationship. Intimacy. Care. Concern. Endearment. A real deep emotional connection. My children. Where else do you hear that phrase in the New Testament? All over this other place. I'll wait. Okay. But where else is the phrase, my children, or my dear children, or my little children used over and over and over again?
You want who said it, or where is it said?
Either one, because they're the same. Hint, hint. 1 John. It's also in 2 John and 3 John, but especially 1 John. If you read through 1 John, you're going to see him parroting this phrase from Jesus. And you can see that he picked this phrase up as Jesus used it for him, so John later uses it as he writes to those who are his juniors in the faith. And so we see this all over the place in the letters and the writings of John. So it gives us a good clue that John got the message, right? Okay? And so that's just an aside, that as we read that in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, think about where he first learned that and where he first heard that. And he heard it from Jesus' lips originally. But anyhow, Jesus informs them in verse 33 here, and this is an important verse. Jesus tells them that he's leaving, and they will not be able to follow him. Now think about the implications for that. They've been following him, living with him, alongside him for 3 years. So what's coming is going to be a completely new existence for them. Every need that they had for those 3 years was met by Jesus Christ. Every single time. Every direction, where they're going next, what they're going to do there, when they're going to leave, when they're going to pick up and move again. All of those things, those instructions came from Jesus. Can you imagine having the guidance and the wisdom of Jesus leading you in every decision, and now that's going to be pulled away? Or you're afraid it's going to be pulled away, let's say that. That's a harsh reality. Go ahead, Lamar.
In a way, it reminds me in a small way of God guiding the children of Israel through the wilderness.
Absolutely.
They never knew when they were leaving or where they were going either until God said, okay, now let's walk.
The cloud or the pillar moved, and they moved too. That's right. That's right. So, it's part of this learning to live on the fly. But you can do that if you've got a leader you can trust. And that's what it boils down to. I can remember when I first went into practice, and you never think you're ready for that first day of practice. I think you could be in training for 20 years, and you'd never feel ready for that first day of practice. But one of the things that I had in my first practice experience was I had a senior physician who was a great physician. And what a comfort that was to me to know that if there's a real significant question here, I've got somebody I can bounce this off of and get some good advice. And I continue to do that throughout my career. I did it by the telephone, when I needed it, and I needed it less and less, but it was still there for me. There are always people who know more than you do. Jody?
When I read this, I try to put it in a earthly form for me.
Yeah.
Like when he talks about my children, I think about my parents and how much they love me. But then when they're talking about this, he's leaving
Well said.
You know, we did everything.
Well said. Yep. We've got those codependent relationships in our lives, and that's what this has become. It's, you know, they are completely dependent on Jesus, and now Jesus is saying, well, time out, this is about to end. This is changing. And what a scare that must have brought up for them. Lamar?
I was going to say, you know, when he died on the cross, you can easily understand what happened to them mentally.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to do next because they hadn't, like you said, they hadn't thought about it for 3 years.
Yeah. And this just didn't fit into their understanding of the plan at all. So that's where their hearts have to be at this moment. Jesus said something in here, just as I told the Jews. Now, what he's referring to is back in chapter 7. And in chapter 7, verses 33 and 34, Jesus had said this. He said, I'm with you for only a short time, and then I go to the one who sent me. You will look for me, but you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come. But on that time, he was talking to the Jews who weren't believing in him. And so as Jesus said that, he was telling them, this was a warning for them, for those Jews. He was giving them a warning that you need to come over to the side of belief and faith. That's important for you. But now it's not exactly the same. He's trying to provide his disciples, not with a warning, but the encouragement that they're going to need going forward. So, he knows that once he leaves, there will be a great test for their faith. That will be a real challenge for them. And will they continue to believe? That will be the question. Well, the next thing that he introduces is this new, what I'm calling, rule of engagement. The basis on how they are going to relate to one another. And no longer is it going to be a shared lineage back to Abraham. That's not going to be the thing that unites them anymore. As you know, Gentiles are going to come into this situation too. So they're not going to all be able to claim descendancy from Abraham any longer. That's not going to be the bond that brings them together. And instead, Jesus says this in verse 34 and 35. A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Jesus says, what I have shown you over these last 3 years is what love really looks like. And you have to love people, and I picked this up from last Sunday's sermon. You have to love people, even the unlovable. And think about it. He had just washed Judas's feet moments before that, before he sent Judas out to do his dirty deed. He had just washed Judas's feet just like the others. And he says, this has to be your new identity. Remember how the chapter started? The chapter started with Jesus, in John's words, showing them the full extent of his love by washing their feet. Now he's washed their feet, even the unlovable, and he says, that is your identity moving forward. Lamar?
There's a real powerful moment couched in right through here with Judas, because as Judas has now gone to betray Jesus, he looks down and sees that his feet are clean. You know, what a tremendous moment for a human being to say, God, my friend just washed my feet, and now I'm doing this too.
And we know that Judas goes through with his treachery. He goes through with the betrayal, but his heart is ripped apart. Because after that, he goes and throws the money back, throws the blood money back at him, and goes and hangs himself. So he can't live with the decision that he has just made.
To his credit,
Yeah.
you know that he had something good about it, even though greed was
That's right.
his master.
That's a perfect example of how Satan will use somebody and spit them out.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example. Okay, verse 34, question for you. Jesus says, loving one another, he says, this is a new command. Well, loving one another, remember Jesus said the greatest command was to love God, and then the second, which is like it, is to love your neighbor. So those were already in place in the Old Testament. So why is Jesus saying, I'm giving you a new command? What's new? You got to look at every word counts. What's new?
They want them to love one another the way he loved them,
Bingo.
which is a lot different than the way they were loving each other.
It revolves around that phrase in verse 34, as I have loved you. They have now seen this thing. For 3 years, Jesus has demonstrated his love, not just to them, but to everybody that they came in contact with. And if you go back through the people we've met through this gospel, you see him sharing his insight and his wisdom with Nicodemus, and you see him talking to the lady of Samaria, and you see him healing a blind man. You see him healing a nobleman's son. And I mean, there's incident after incident of this tremendous giving of himself. Earlier that evening, Jesus has taken the time to wash their feet. And when he did that, he said, this is the most important thing I can teach you. This is the message you have to get. So the command wasn't really new, but the example and how to do it was. So Christ has now shown us God's love in real life. Imagine how the Jews approached those commandments from the Old Testament. Well, okay, I have to love my neighbor. Well, define love. And I'm sure they did that. And how far do I have to go to show love? And when have I done enough love? You know, that's the way they would have been approaching this. And Jesus says, no, it's not like that at all. It's not about following the rules and trying to figure out if you followed the rule or not. It's about becoming a different person and having different character and being a loving person like your Father in heaven and like I have demonstrated to you, Jesus says. It's a sacrificial love, exactly. Yes. And so Jesus puts meat on the bones to the Old Testament commandment. He says, this is a new way of loving. I'm showing you something that's new. You've never seen it before.
You know, one more thing. It's obvious from previous conversations that he knew that he didn't tell them that this wasn't going to happen because they were going to revert back to that attitude that they had before, who's the greatest and all of that.
That's right.
That's because that's human nature.
That's right.
And this is now he's shifting their paradigm and recalibrating them and saying, no, it looks like this.
This has to change.
Yep.
This has to change, guys. It's the end. This has to change. It's a desperate appeal. So Jesus has changed theory into real life here. And then we get to verse 35, which we already read. By this all men will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. And Jesus now goes a step further, and he says, love, and that kind of love is expected from those who are his. It's not an option. It is who you are. Their identity as disciples of Jesus Christ will depend upon them demonstrating that very character, that very way of life. With that identity, Jesus says, you will testify, and ultimately the Holy Spirit will convict the whole world with that identity. But without that identity, they will be seen as frauds. If they don't show that love for one another, they will be nothing more than frauds. And guess what? It hasn't changed. It is still on us today. It is that same identity that must be what defines the people of Christ, the people of God. There is no option. There is no other thing. And without that identity, we're frauds. So whenever we look around and we say, the gospel isn't being seen, the gospel isn't being heard, guess what? Who's that fall on? Us. Better believe it. And because sometimes most of the time, we get our emphasis in the wrong syllable, in the wrong place, right? Instead of demonstrating what Jesus talks about as our identifying trait, we usually revert to a bunch of rules. It is a new command, and it's something that needs to wake us up. Man, I don't know where the time goes. Peter, however, is stuck. Peter's still back on verse 33. Peter's still back on verse 33 because Jesus has said he's going somewhere where Peter can't, and Peter can't get his hands around that. He can't get his mind around that. And so let's read about Peter again. Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." And Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I'll lay down my life for you." And then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Peter understood why the Jews of chapter 7 couldn't follow Jesus, because they weren't aligned with Jesus. But Peter and the other guys in the room, they want to be with Jesus. So why can't they follow him now? Jesus is kind of, from one side, he's shutting the door. And Peter said, "Why can't I follow you? Where is it that we're going?" And Jesus responds, essentially, he starts by answering exactly as he did back in verse 33. He says, "You can't come. You cannot come here." But he adds something in. Don't forget that. He says, "But you will follow later." There's some work to be done. Interestingly, in verse 33, when Jesus says, "Where I am going, you cannot come," the "you" is plural. Jesus is speaking to everybody in the room in verse 33. But when he responds to Peter's question in verse 36, when he says, "You will follow later," that is singular. Now he's talking to Peter, solely to Peter. He's having a one-on-one discussion, essentially. Well, it's a one-on-one in front of 10 others, is what it is. He's telling Peter, you aren't ready yet. Your purpose hasn't yet been realized. You are not yet fit. But in verse 37, we see Peter's just unsatisfied. "I am ready for this, Jesus." And he goes so far as to claim that he will sacrifice his own life to save Jesus. Verse 38, Jesus answers rather sharply again to Peter. We've talked about that in a couple of different instances now in the gospel, where Jesus answers Peter not subtly or necessarily even kindly, rather sharply. And he throws Peter's words right back at him. "Will you really lay down your life for me?" And then he says, "Truly, truly," or "Verily, verily," or "I tell you the truth." What he's saying is, here's the reality about you, Peter. You are not there yet. And in fact, you're going to become a bad example before this night is over. Wow. And think about this, that first of all, he's already gotten on Peter once that evening. Back in verses 7 through 10, when Peter didn't think that Jesus should wash his feet. And he already got on Peter about that. And now when Peter wants to go where Jesus is going to be, Jesus says, "You are not ready." We once again come to grips with Peter's personality. And Peter is that guy that is just overconfident in himself, and he's got it all figured out for himself, but he forgets about God's plan. And we saw it a couple weeks ago. We talked about a verse that I thought was in Luke. It's actually back in Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus begins to talk to them in the Gospel of Matthew about the fact that he's going to be leaving, and he will be dying and be raised back to life. And Peter says, no way, that's not going to happen. And Jesus ultimately says to him, get behind me, Satan. He has to be sharp with Peter to get his attention sometimes. And now we've seen on two different occasions here in John 13 that he has to redress Peter again and again. So the bottom line for Peter is that at this point in time, he doesn't have the faith in Jesus that he needs to have. His faith is not yet there. He doesn't have the trust. Now think about what that means for the rest of the guys in the room, because Peter is kind of their leader. He's the one that gets to the conclusion of who Jesus is before anybody else. They're watching Peter, and they're kind of falling in line with him. So if this is where the strongest of us is, and he's not going to last the night, where's the rest of us at? And that's got to be going through every one of their minds. This is not just a lesson for Peter, it's a lesson for everybody in the room. It's a lesson for every one of them.
You know, they gotta love Peter, because he always says what they're thinking and gets in trouble.
Yeah. Peter is the one who asks the obvious question most of the time, you know. He's the setup man. He's the straight guy. but he takes it on the chin a lot. Clem?
Isn't there a place in there where it's the apostles said, if we barely make it, what it is for the other?
That's right.
You know where that is? It's in Peter.
I can't offhand remember. Maybe somebody else has got it, about scarcely being saved. I think it's in Hebrews. It's sort of in the last third or so of Hebrews. If we are scarcely saved, what about those?
What about those in here?
Yeah. So we'll see if we can find that in a minute. I've just got one other thought here before. I was going to try to provide an introduction to 14, 15, and 16, but we're not going to get there today. These passages of Scripture just open up in front of us sometimes in class. But there's one more thought here that's important, and that is Jesus is he's not giving up on Peter. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Verse 36, although there's doubts about where Peter's at right now, Jesus says, you will follow later. So Jesus, in spite of all of Peter's issues, Jesus remains optimistic about him. And this is an anticipation of what we're going to see, not in chapter 19 or even chapter 20 about Peter, but when we get to chapter 21, we're going to see Peter used as a model of humility now and willing to do it God's way. And I honestly think that's one of the big reasons that John includes chapter 21 in the narrative, is to bring us an understanding of the place that Peter will fulfill in the early church, which is clearly a very, very leading role. Okay? Were you able to find that or not yet? Okay. 1 Peter 4:18. Yeah, throw away my Hebrews idea. 1 Peter 4:18. Thank you. So there we have the conclusion of John chapter 13. We are ready to move into chapter 14. And once again, I would just encourage you to spend some time reading through 14, 15, and 16. Because it's not an easy passage of Scripture to understand. And when you go through 14 through 16, you might as well add in 17, which is the prayer of Jesus. So next week, we'll plan to introduce that section before we actually move into it. And I'll just cut today's lesson in half. Okay, God is good. Thank you all.